And the fifth tradition that we're going to look at is the critical tradition of power. It's critical and power go hand in hand. And the word critical does not mean that we criticize, although it often does sound that way. It's critical is almost a synonym for the word power, or particularly the understanding of and abuse of power. So the people that study in the critical tradition are against things like the abuse of power, the domination of historically oppressed groups. And they are for more equality, more democracy, or at least democratic ideals, and greater participation for historically marginalized groups that are pushed to the margins. So let's dig a little deeper about what the critical crowd is against. They are against essentially the abuse of power, but they want to study exactly how that abuse of power gets perpetuated. And so this tradition argues that the main problem in society and in organizations, that's usually a special area that this group focuses on, are the ideological forces that prevent or distort open communication. In other words, they don't believe that everybody really has an equal voice in shaping society and the world. And so they're against that. They see that as the main problem. They call that systematically distorted communication. You know how in a conversation every once in a while one person talks more than the other? And that is normal. Most days it's normal. Some days it gets annoying, but over time you would think that it works out, right? So maybe you talk a little bit more one time, and then your friend talks a little bit more the next time you hang out, and so over time it should get relatively equaled out. Well, systematically distorted communication is where that ongoing lopsidedness of most communication becomes normal. It's where one group's interests routinely get heard and other voices get pushed to the fringes. So it's not like, oh, you talked a lot this time, I'll talk a lot the next time, I'll be heard the next time. But mostly people in dominant positions of power in society routinely have their voices heard, and people that don't have all that power don't get heard. Now, students are a great example of a group of people in society that do not get heard very often. For example, a lot of students in the past have talked about, oh, we should lower the drinking age. That's kind of typical, and not all students really care about this, but they'll say things like, well, at 18, we can fight in a war and defend our country, but then if we win the war, we can't even celebrate by having a beer. So here's the question. Do students have a big voice in society compared to, for example, corporations? So what do you think? Who has a better chance of changing the laws? Do you think Anheuser-Busch, the people who own Budweiser, have a better chance of lowering the drinking age by lobbying Congress with people they pay to change politicians' minds? Or do you think students have a better chance to actually get the drinking age lower? I personally believe that a large corporation, and perhaps if those beverage companies all bound together, that they probably could get the drinking age lowered, much more likely anyway, than if college students complained a little louder. So some voices get heard instead of other voices, and that's really the problem. Here's another example, and this is a true one. So in the last decade or more, the coal industry has argued for reducing regulations on coal miners and processing coal. And they have. And so they say, hey, look at air quality, you're too strict, so let's reduce that. All kinds of safety and prevention rules, okay, let's reduce that. And so they've changed the laws. And now the people that live in that community, the people that live near the coal mines and that have to breathe in all the coal dust and things like that, they had almost no voice in that process. They couldn't afford to hire lobbyists to change the laws and to argue on their behalf and maintain clean air and safety. And so some groups have a more powerful voice than others. In our society, I think it's really typical that people who are very young and also very old tend to lack voice. I mean, when's the last time anybody listened to anybody who was, over retirement age? Not many people. I mean, how old are people before we feel like it's normal to start ignoring them? I would say, once they're retired, right? 65, 70, 75. I mean, you don't need to listen to them. They're old. That's the thinking in our society. In some societies, it's just the opposite. The older you get, the more you must know because you've lived through it. We also ignore very young people in the society. You can't vote until a certain age. You can't really do much until you're an adult. So the solution from this critical view is, and that is, what do they want? Well, they want to unmask those distortions, those systematically distorted communication processes. They want to make that lopsidedness of society's communication more visible, to liberate participants to speak in their own interests. By the way, a quick pause here. The word systematically distorted communication, it has the word system in it. And so a lot of times people think, oh, that must mean cybernetic. There's an example of a time that the word system comes up where this is not part of the cybernetic tradition. It's coincidence that the term systematically distorted communication has the word system in it. This is definitely a critical tradition theory. And so this approach, back to the program here, this approach seeks more equality, more voice, and more participation for all people in society. They're looking for each group and everybody who has a stake in the way society is shaped. We want everybody to be able to contribute to shaping our society, because the critical people think that if more voices are in the mix, then you will have decisions and you will have a culture that helps everybody and creates a more healthy society. There are many ways that communication gets systematically distorted, and many ways that some voices get heard over others. And we're just going to look at 4 ways that you may have noticed in conversations that you've had that certain points of view get shut down. They get excluded, they get silenced, they get diminished. And so the other voice, the dominant voice, is the one that often gets heard. People may not be doing this deliberately. In fact, you may have just internalized ways of thinking that do this. It might even feel natural and normal to you that, oh, this is, I'm not doing this on purpose. I'm not a bad person. And you may certainly have heard other people, and maybe even you've felt it done to you. So let's take the first one. There are many others. It's just 4. The first one is called naturalization. And naturalization is the notion that the existing social order is natural. It comes from nature, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it. You just have to accept it. A classic example is boys will be boys. You hear that expression after you hear someone is cheating on their wife or their girlfriend, and someone shrugs and says, hey, boys will be boys. In other words, it's natural for guys to cheat. There's nothing you can do about it. You're arguing against nature. And that's not exactly true, by the way. Of course, many guys don't cheat. And cheating is not exclusive to guys. It's just this excuse that people make that's camouflaged as something that's from nature. Another one is, it's just business. People say that phrase a lot, and it shuts down a whole discussion about ethics and morals. For example, someone will say, well, I don't want to lie to customers. I'm not comfortable with that. And maybe a supervisor says, look, it's just business. What are you going to do? All the other companies are doing it, and that's business. And so you're supposed to just shrug and say, okay, well, I guess that person's right. What are you going to do? Business is cutthroat. Business is unethical. And the only way to make money is to be unethical. So when we do this, we're shutting down the discussion about how our business practices could work. When we do this in the example of boys will be boys, we're shutting down a whole discussion that might focus on personal responsibility for one's choices. The idea that loyalty is possible. And when you favor and hold up some views as if they are from nature, you're basically saying that the other voices don't need to be heard, and they get shut down and silenced. When people pull a move like that, boys will be boys, or that's just business, it's almost always the end of the discussion. It really closes off continuing to discuss things in that way. And so it lopsides or systematically distorts that conversation. Neutralization is the next one, and that is acting as if facts or statistics or numbers are in some way pure. So there's no human effort. That's the idea. No human effort went into figuring out what fact that was, or how that statistic came to be. When in fact, a lot of times, there's great human effort and creativity to make statistics come out the way you want them to come out. And so pretending that the numbers are pure, you'll hear people say, look, you can't argue with numbers. Numbers don't lie. You've probably heard that expression, numbers don't lie. The other part of the expression is numbers don't lie, but liars use numbers. And that basically means that, look, if you want to make a certain point, you can go find a statistic somewhere that supports your point of view. And not only that, you can manufacture some statistic that supports your point of view. Earlier, we talked about in the area of rhetoric, for example, that 3 out of 4 dentists recommend Crest. Well, that sounds like a hard fact, and you can't argue with numbers. But really, as we saw, a lot of effort went into shaping that statistic or that fact to look a certain way. So anytime we act as if the facts are pure and there was no human effort, that's neutralization. All facts, all statistics are created by and for humans, and we use them or ignore them based upon what we're trying to get across. So that's one way we silence people. You can't argue with numbers. These are just the facts. The third one is disqualification, and that's where we choose something about that other person that gets them out of the conversation so we don't have to listen to them. Maybe we highlight their gender. Maybe we highlight their race. Maybe we highlight that they were born and raised in Rhode Island. Maybe we highlight the fact that they were a Democrat or a Republican or too old or too young. You can find there's really no limit to how we disqualify people. So let's say you're trying to chime in and you want to have your perspective heard, and someone might say, oh, you can't be trusted. You voted for so-and-so. And you think, oh, wow, now I'm totally out of this discussion. I'm disqualified because I didn't vote for the right person, so I can't contribute to this discussion. We do that quite often. Gender is another really common one. In the workplace, for example, let's say you're in some mechanic's shop and you have a bunch of mechanics there, and maybe there's could be a female mechanic, but oftentimes because of gender roles, you don't see that as much, and maybe there's someone working at the front desk and they're a female. And the new boss says, okay, everybody, let's gather around. We're going to talk about some ideas and how to improve the garage, how to improve the service station. And then the female secretary or desk person comes in and says, oh, great. And then the boss says, oh, no, this is just for the guys. But we're going to talk about that. But thanks. And you know what you could do, though? You could go make us some coffee. That's a disqualifying move. That's a systematic distorted communication move that gets that person out of the discussion. And who knows? Maybe she had some great ideas about how to make the service station run better, more effectively. But too late, right? Disqualified. So we get disqualified in all kinds of different ways. You hear this a lot. Subjectification is the fourth one. And that's where we treat our opinion as the truth, and everybody else has their personal opinion. So we have the truth, you just have your own little point of view, and it kind of downgrades perspectives that disagree as an opinion. And you'll literally hear people say that, well, you know what, that's your opinion, or hey, everybody's entitled to their opinion. And the implication there is that you have your opinion, but you're arguing an opinion with the truth. And so as soon as you label something as an opinion, it's subjective. It's not objective. It's not an objective truth. It's subjective or personal. And so we can just ignore it, because if it's just personal, then it's just you. And if it's just you, then that doesn't add up to very much. And so these are the different ways our conversations get lopsided over time, and boy, it feels really silencing when people use these against us, and the people in the critical area look to concepts like this to show us, look at this is how our world, or our social world, our organizations, they like to focus on organizations, get lopsided, and some things we just can't talk about, that we're not really allowed in a way. We get carved out of the discussion in all these different ways. And so I think it's a really interesting area of research, and these are just some of the examples of how systematically distorted communication shows that power imbalance. And that's why we talk about power in this area, because communication and the ability to be heard is a kind of power.